the radical, fundamental principles of freedom, rational self-interest, and individual rights. This is the Yaron Brook Show.
All right, everybody, welcome to the Yaron Brook Show. Hopefully everybody's having a fantastic week so far. I guess today was the first day back. Yesterday was a holiday. Hope you enjoyed the long weekend and you're all ready to go at work. So thanks for joining me tonight. Well, Catherine's here. Is Catherine here? Yeah, Catherine's here. All right, cool. Excellent. So we've got somebody to keep track and to motivate you guys. Let's see. Today we're going to talk about neoliberalism. I've got a video that Ashton asked me to review, so we're going to go over that video and talk about it. Thank you, Ashton. $500 to do this, so really appreciate the sponsorship. Ashton has already started us off with the super chat with $50, so that's exciting. Thank you, Ashton. Remember, the goal is $650. You can ask questions, you can make comments, you can make suggestions, you can complain, you can do whatever you want as long as you put a dollar amount to it. Value for value. We are traders here. So thanks, Ashton, again. And let's see. Oh, and after we did the neoliberalism, I was asked last show to review 2 songs. I don't know why you're asking me to review songs. I don't know where this came from, but I don't think I started it. But anyway, I will talk about 2 songs, one by very different songs, very different. One by Weird Al Yankovic and one by Rammstein. About as different as you can get, right? About as different as you can get. So we will be talking about those songs as well towards the second part of the show today, and then of course we'll open it up to any questions you might have. So we're going to get started today talking about neoliberalism, which is we'll get to what it refers to, and we're going to use, for the purpose of this, for that discussion, we're going to use a video that Ashton asked for me to comment on, and that is a video by a YouTuber called the Cynical Historian. Yeah, I would call him something different, but we'll get to that. I don't know how cynical he is. I'm not sure how much of an historian he is. But anyway, before we get to the insults, we should actually review some of the content. All right, John, thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed the Rules for Life show, and thank you for the support. Really appreciate it. All right, we'll have to gangbuster start with $100 right off the bat. So remember, 650 is the goal. I'll post on the chat where we are, and Catherine will serve as our cheerleader. All right. So neoliberalism, we're going to go over this video by Cynical Historian. I'd never heard of Cynical Historian, but he's got a significant number of followers. 200 and almost 300,000. And this particular video has well over 200,000 views. So this stuff looks like it's he's influential. So we'll see what he has to say. Now, what's interesting about the video, I have watched it once. I haven't gone through it in great detail. We're not going to get through the whole video. I'll just stop by there. No way, right? Because every minute is 5 minutes of me commenting, and the video itself is 37 minutes. We're going to start at minute 3, approximately, just to get us going. But the reason I like this topic is not necessarily not only Ashton wants me to talk about it, but I think that It raises a lot of questions about history, about economics, about interpretation of history, about what's happened over the last 50 years. A lot of, not just 100 years, 150 years really, that are truly mistaken, that but that seem to be repeated. That is, in the culture, they're accepted and repeated and repeated and repeated, and they become like truth. And so one of the advantages of going over this is not only will we uncover some falsehoods, but we'll also talk about what's real and what is reality, and I think that'll be helpful. We'll begin by, just what neoliberalism is. Whoops. What happened to, did I never turn on the video? Did I switch? Oh, I meant to switch to this. There we go. We'll talk about what neoliberalism is. I think that's how the Cynical historian begins this, and we'll go from there. So I'll have a lot of commentary as we go through the video. You guys tell me, make sure that you can hear the sound and that the volume's right and everything's cool. Otherwise, we'll work on it. Okay, here we go.
Ideology that has defined the last 40 years, so it can never be comprehensive. Either way, there are some specific characteristics that unify it, which are emphasis on individuality.
So he's starting out by saying, look, we can't define, like most moderns, they don't like definitions. We're not going to define neoliberalism. We're going to describe a few of its characteristics. And neoliberalism has been, according to him, the dominant set of ideas, at least within the economic sphere, in the United States over the last 40 years. It is the dominant set. So a lot has happened. So he can't cover it all, and that makes sense. So who is this guy? He is the Cynical historian. You can look him up, the Cynical historian, on YouTube.
And rejection of groups, market liberalism.
So that's not bad. So the first characteristic of neoliberalism is, and you probably heard neoliberalism a lot. People talk about it a lot. Neoliberalism is a kind of a catch-all. It's been attacked. It's been defended, although it hasn't been defended much. It's not clear, is neoliberalism on the left, is neoliberalism on the right? It's probably more of a feature of what we call the mushy, hard to define. And I agree with him, neoliberalism is hard to define because I don't think there is such a thing, but neoliberalism is this mushy center. So he's trying to characterize what this is. Emphasis on individuality and rejection of groups. There's an essence that's true. There is, so neoliberalism is, we'll get to what it describes, but it's liberalism. Liberalism comes from the idea of liberty. It's the idea of limited government. It's the idea that the government's job is to preserve the liberty of the individual. Liberalism, historically, classical liberalism, has been an ideology of the preservation of the individual. It's been an individualistic ideology, again, the classical liberal form, and a rejection of groups. So neoliberalism picks on that a little bit. It's not overly individualistic, but it is true that it emphasizes the individual more than groups. It's not as collectivistic as, let's say, socialism or fascism or any of the other popular ideologies out there. It's definitely more about individual prosperity in economic terms and individual choices in economic terms. Not, I wouldn't say individualism, and I wouldn't say individual freedom, as we'll see, but certainly an emphasis on individual choices and individual wealth. It's about market liberalism, which means market freedom, market liberty, and fiscal conservatism. It's not clear what fiscal conservatism means, but probably means not spending too much, by the government. And market liberalism means a general tendency towards letting markets function, letting markets work, right? We'll see in a minute whether this is the history of the last 40 years. He's going to go over the last 40 years. We'll see how good of an historian he is.
And fiscal conservatism, which is kind of the same thing. Privatization of public goods and infrastructure.
Okay, so neoliberal regimes or governments will privatize a lot of the public goods, whatever public goods mean. Again, public goods are not a legitimate concept. Nothing is owned by the public. But the idea, public goods are typically things like healthcare, education, national parks, public lands. Those are, quote, public goods. Infrastructure, roads are considered public goods. Anything that conventionally people can't imagine how the private sector could deliver, they rope under the term public goods. But remember, goods production happens by private individuals. Ideally, everything would be private, but and good, right? Good is something that applies to an individual. Good, bad, goods to be consumed, goods to be enjoyed, applies to people as individuals, not as collectives. So there's no such thing really as the public good.
Deregulating government controls on corporate excess.
Okay, so liberalism is about notice, we have to go back a second. Like, he doesn't say deregulating business. Note how he describes it.
Privatization of public goods and infrastructure. Deregulating government controls on corporate excess.
Deregulating government controls on corporate excess. Note how he is injecting his views. What is corporate excess? How do you define corporate excess? Too much profit? Behavior you don't like? What does corporate excess actually mean? Excess of what? So it's not enough to say deregulating corporations. That would be too neutral for him. He's already sneaking in his particular ideology, which is the ideology of the left, and not the center left, which he would define as neoliberal, but probably the more Bernie Sanders left, or I don't know, socialist left. It's not clear exactly what his ideology is just on this video, but it's clearly left of center. No, left of center. Left of center. Okay, corporate excesses.
Austerity measures against welfare.
Austerity measures against welfare means shrinking welfare.
And free trade agreements that allow for more rapid globalization.
What's interesting is people who use the term neoliberals and accused and complain about neoliberalism are usually people who emphasize this issue of trade. They're usually anti-trade people. Neoliberalism is now hated by both left and right. It is anti-populist. And the primary thing people hate about neoliberalism, I've noticed this is the term used a lot in the UK. It's used a lot in Europe. The thing they most dislike is globalization. Neoliberalism was a term used a lot during Brexit, but globalization is the enemy. So neoliberalism is globalization. Now, what do I think neoliberalism is? If I had to define neoliberalism is the mixed economy with a slight tilt towards markets. So neoliberalism is the status quo we've had. Neoliberalism is what Fukuyama said basically won when the Berlin Wall came down. It's liberal democracy. It's, democracy, limited democracy, so not pure, unlimited democracy, limited democracy, but without the recognition of individual rights, there's no conception really of individual rights, with just a general belief in the freedom of the individual, the political freedom of the individual. Economically, it's a system that allows some freedom, particularly of consumer choice, but that heavily regulates business, right? But regulates in a particular way. So it doesn't regulate prices, because we've learned from Hayek that's bad. So we don't regulate prices. It regulates, as he said, kind of corporate behavior, what they view as corporate excesses. So it tries to get the corporations to behave in what is a nice way, right? So it's regulation, but a different type of regulation historically, where prices were set and everything, all the conditions were set. Here it leaves the consumer to helps set prices through supply and demand. It doesn't try to intervene too much in supply and demand, except with healthcare. But in other areas, it doesn't try that. It leaves the market to determine that and then overlays onto that control over behavior, right? Let's see what else. So there is a certain level of emphasis on individuals as compared to what came before the particular mixed economy that we're talking about from the 1970s on. There's a little bit more emphasis on allowing markets to work while regulating them. Fiscal conservatism, if you look at government spending, particularly in the United States, I don't know where that fiscal conservatism comes from. Austerity measures against warfare, yeah, there's some criticism of warfare, some restraint regarding warfare, but there's no questioning of warfare. There's no challenging of warfare. There's no attempt to replace warfare. There's just a little tightening of the conditions, like Bill Clinton's warfare reform that was passed. And then finally, free trade, yes, definitely free trade. So more free trade, more emphasis on free trade, although it's not free. Note that almost all trade agreements are not free trade agreements. They're what we'll call managed trade agreements. They are unfree trade agreements. Free trade is easy. Just lower tariffs to zero. But these don't. They say, okay, Mexico will trade with you. Most things will have a tariff of zero, but some things will have a very high tariff. And other things we just can't import because they have to be licensed over here. And your doctors can't work in the United States, and your truckers can't drive in the United States. And so, and by the way, if you want to export into the United States your goods, then your labor has to be treated in a particular way, and wages have to be this, and environmental things have to be that. Very, very controlled, very managed. But generally, in a big picture, less restrictions, moving towards what you would call, less tariffs, less restrictions generally. And that's true. Since World War II, we have moved towards greater and greater and greater trade freedom. And I'd say, with the exception of Trump, that path has been pretty steady, although there were bumps on the way. There were still tariffs during Reagan, and there were some tariffs during Bush. Every president does something, but the only one who was anti-trade was Trump. But generally a movement towards more of these agreements. Right? So that's neoliberalism, is the mixed economy with a little bit of emphasis more on markets. I'd say Scandinavia is basically neoliberal. Most of Europe is neoliberal in this sense. And the United States is neoliberal, as is places like Japan and Korea. They're not capitalist. They're not classical liberal. They're not either politically, philosophically, or economically individualistic and free. But they're mixed, centrist, and tilt towards markets. Even somebody like Bill Clinton, you would say centrist on market issues, tilted a little bit towards markets. As compared to Johnson, FDR, or even Nixon, who I don't think was tilted towards market, tilted away from markets. That's what I think of neoliberals. And there's a sense in which that ideology of a mixed economy with a slight tilt towards freedom has been dominant until Trump in the United States, and I'd say in most of Europe, since Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. Really since Jimmy Carter, although not so much ideological, more. So it's the status quo, or the status quo 7 years ago. Status quo 7 years ago. And Obama was mixed economy, tilted a little away from markets, but he wasn't an out-and-out socialist, and obviously in healthcare tilted quite a bit against markets. But it wasn't like Obama's period was massive regulations and massive controls and massive, like Johnson or FDR. I mean, even Bush had Sarbanes-Oxley. Yeah, Sarbanes-Oxley. Obama had Dodd-Frank. They all had their own big regulatory bills, but they almost did them apologetically. The market was still their focus. They still believe to some extent that markets work as long as they're controlled, as long as they're regulated. Right? Whatever the hell that means, right? What are markets when they're controlled? Are they markets? Are they still markets? They like the semblance of it. They're like entrepreneurs can still start businesses as long as they have a license and they got permission and they got all the stuff, everything ticked off, particularly poor people. We don't want them starting too many businesses. And consumers can buy whatever they want, except for pharmaceuticals and except for illegal drugs and except for things that the government has deemed not safe and all that stuff. But generally, within the scope of the thousands or millions of products we have available, we can go and choose what products we can buy. Right? But it's obviously not free markets. So this is neoliberalism. My interpretation, this is my version of it, or my accurate version of what neoliberalism is what I've just discussed.
Some politicians may not fit these precisely, and that's why neoliberalism isn't just some specific ideology. It's the entire economic paradigm the US has been in since at least the Reagan administration. As you will see, there is no concrete definition, nor even a starting point.
Yeah, I mean, modern intellectuals don't believe in definitions, and don't really like starting points either. They like to be mushy, fuzzy, a little unclear. Now, neoliberalism, granted, is not a clear concept because I don't think anybody has a clear conception of what it is. I think what I gave is the closest you're going to get. And I agree with them. This vague general notion started probably around Reagan in the United States, certainly with Margaret Thatcher in the UK, spread throughout Europe and much of the world during the 1980s and 1990s. Probably started in the US under Jimmy Carter. He'll mention that.
It's hazy. If you have trouble with that ambiguity, well, that's just what good history is. Embrace the suck. I had to take an entire grad class oriented around these questions. So yeah, capitalism is not a static thing, and neoliberalism is but a permutation of it.
So here's the other thing that everybody does. Everybody does. They never define capitalism. Capitalism is even vaguer, more mushy than even neoliberalism in their mind. Capitalism in anything that has private property. Even if the private property is controlled, taxed, regulated, it's still capitalism. So for them, we live under capitalism today. We've always lived under capitalism, at least since through the 19th century and to today. It's all capitalism. And capitalism could take forms of progressive capitalism and neoliberal capitalism and this kind of capitalism and that kind of capitalism and all these other kind of capitalists. And there is no such thing. Capitalism is one thing. It is free, unregulated markets in which the government protects property rights, and that's it, and leaves the economy alone. It is the complete separation of economics from state. In that sense, we've barely had capitalism, and we have very little of it today, and that's what I mean by mixed economy. We have some capitalism and some socialism, some controls or some fascism, some controls, some redistribution, and some markets. But we don't have capitalism. There are no forms of capitalism. This is why I don't like people using the term crony capitalism. No, cronyism is a feature of statism. I don't like people using the term conscious capitalism. Well, in a sense, all capitalism is conscious. It requires consciousness. But there is no some type of capitalism. There's only one. And that is where the government leaves you free and where private property is owned by private people, and all property is owned privately, and where the government is separate from the economy. That's capitalism. You might hate it, that's fine, but let's just accept a definition, somebody provide a definition. So at what point, if a little bit of private property counts as capitalism, at what point does it disappear? Then you get the wolf, pseudo-Marxist economist who claims that, capitalism existed during the Egyptians when they built the pyramids. That was capitalism because I guess there was some private property. The king had private property. I don't know. So it becomes a meaningless concept. So it's important to be clear. It's important to define. Nice music. There you go. Ooh, we got the credits. I should have probably started after.
Progressivism attempted to reform capitalism, first with folks like Teddy.
No, capitalism reduces wages. Capitalism is the only system in history to raise wages. But, all right, to the extent that there was capitalism in the 19th century, it's what raised wages. To the extent that there was capitalism in the 19th century, it's what brought people out of poverty. But
Roosevelt, and then with his cousin Franklin Delano Roosevelt, after laissez-faire capitalism failed to regulate itself.
Did laissez-faire capitalism fail to regulate itself? Is that true? Historically speaking, this is the historian. I think he's got a PhD, or at least a master's in history. Was the Great Depression caused by capitalism not regulating itself, or was it caused by a Federal Reserve out of control, both during the 1920s and then during the 1930s? Was it caused by bad policy by the Hoover administration? Smoot-Hawley, for example, restricting trade, raising the income tax in the midst of a recession. What about all the policies that FDR put in place that did not get us out of the Great Depression? Maybe they caused the Great Depression to be deeper, longer than it had to be. No, it's accepted wisdom. You can say things like, well, capitalism failed. We had the Great Depression. And everybody goes, oh, yep, that's right. This is why it's so important in dinner parties. If somebody says that, you go, no, I don't want to get into it necessarily, but just so you know, there are many, many historians and economists who don't think capitalism caused the Great Depression or the financial crisis. That it was actually the Federal Reserve and government that caused those crises. And you'll watch their brain go into, they won't know what to make of it because, God, they've never heard that before. Never heard that before. So he's taking for granted, and this is the advantage our opposition has. The advantage the left has, and the right, is that history, they're writing the history. They're writing economic history. They're writing political history. They're writing the social history. So the only history that people know, that people accept, that is common, is their history, is the history according to them. And therefore they can leverage that. They can say something like Great Depression caused by capitalism not regulating itself, and everybody goes, yeah, all right, cool, we agree with that. And then they go on. Nobody questions it. But very few economists actually believe that. Very few economists actually believe that. At least decently trained economists, but very few. Because enough literature has been written about the fact that much of the Great Depression was caused by Federal Reserve being too loose with money and then being too tight with money, and Hoover and then Roosevelt.
Especially after the Great Depression began, progressives believed that the government needed to regulate the economy. Teddy's Square Deal pushed for the 3 C's, which were conservation of natural resources, control of corporations, and consumer protection.
This is Teddy Roosevelt, the Republican, or the progressive Republican, who really was the first popular progressive, the first progressive to really attain political power and really popularize the progressive agenda. But progressivism is an ideology that was prevalent in the United States from the middle of the 19th century and gained political power through Teddy Roosevelt and then primarily through Woodrow Wilson. And then its programs, many of its programs were put into practice. Don't let a good crisis go to waste. So they were put in practice by FDR during the 1930s. But conservation of natural resources, that means not all property will be private. Control of corporations, that means corporations are not truly private, are not truly free. And consumer protection means consumers are now told what they can and cannot buy, under what conditions they can buy, under what conditions businesses can produce for them. All of these three are limitations on capitalism, or restrictions on capitalism, are movements away from capitalism. So it's the growth of government, the growth of regulatory state, the growth of government control over our lives, or particularly over our economic lives, over issues related to private property. This is kind of the beginning of this mixed economy, right? We had a relatively free economy from the end of the Civil War, certainly through the beginning of the 1890s, and then we get the Antitrust Act, which wasn't really enforced much, but into the early part of the 20th century, and then people like Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, and FDR basically killed whatever was the capitalist element in the U.S. economy and brought about a pure mixed economy, which still had many features of the free market, so elements of capitalism, but you could not call it capitalist.
FDR's New Deal pushed for the 3 R's, which were relief from poverty, recovery of the economy, and reform.
Of course, relief from poverty means redistribution of wealth. I mean, who's not for relief of poverty? And of course, the best system in history, and the system would actually, if we embraced it, we would have no poverty today, was capitalism. Capitalism was the relief from poverty. Capitalism, unregulated, unfettered, uncontrolled by the progressives, by the institutions that people like Woodrow Wilson put in place, would have eliminated poverty by the time, but certainly by today. Another 2% GDP growth per year over the last 100 years would have eliminated poverty. So true relief of poverty is that. But what they mean by relief of poverty is redistribution of wealth. Whether it relieves poverty or not is irrelevant, because people today, we have massive redistribution of wealth, and yet people still complain about poverty constantly. Recovery of the economy. Did the economy recover during the Great Depression? Did the economy recover after, with FDR as president? No, the economy didn't recover. The economy continued to struggle. It continued to struggle really until the end of World War II, when finally we got some regulatory reform. We got a massive input of labor from the war, the men returning for war. We got better economic policies under Eisenhower, Truman and then Eisenhower, and we got economic growth back again. But the economy did not recover because of the New Deal. And finally, reform of regulations. Notice, reform of regulations. The beauty of this is that in the early 1930s, there weren't a lot of regulations. There were some important ones, but there weren't a lot of regulations. And what the 1930s saw is a flood of new regulations. So the New Deal didn't involve reforming regulations. It involved massive new regulations. Not a reforming, but an expansion, a dramatic expansion. Again, to take us away from leaning towards a capitalist system to becoming a true, welfare state, mixed regulatory state, mixed economy. We had regulations before the New Deal, but not that many. The New Deal made us a regulatory economy, regulated economy.
Form of regulations. Every president from FDR to Nixon were New Dealers. They believed in the 3 R's and pushed for their own deals. But there was some significant opposition. First were the conservative coalition from the 1930s, who claimed that the New Deal was socialist. Much like many today, they think
socialism is when the government does stuff.
Oh, my
And
favorite
it's more
economist.
socialism, the more stuff it does. And if it does a real lot of stuff, it's communism.
no, that's not socialism at all. But most conservatives do not understand
True,
that
it's not
terminology
socialism.
even a century ago. Regardless, the old right failed to take hold, and New Dealers maintained dominance. But a new kind of liberalism, as in the liberalization of the market, arose in popularity during the 1970s. That was neoliberalism.
Okay, so now he's getting into what neoliberalism is and where we're heading in terms of neoliberalism. Yeah, I mean, we've devoted a lot of time to this. So we'll do a little bit longer, and we'll see how far we get. Again, you could do 5 shows on this because there's so much content here. And there's so much falsehood about the history, as we'll see. We'll see a bit of it. We've done 3 minutes in 35, so it's 10x.
It had deep roots. Much of the economic arguments of the New Deal came from John Maynard Keynes, who said, whilst the enlargement of the functions of government involved in the task of adjusting to one another the propensity to consume the inducement to invest, would seem to the 19th century publicist, or to a contemporary American financier, to be a terrific encroachment on individualism.
It was a terrific encroachment on individualism and bad economics.
I defend it on the contrary,
Keynes
both
doesn't agree.
as the only practicable means of avoiding the destruction of existing economic forms in their entirety, and as the condition of the successful functioning of individual initiative.
Yeah, so Keynes was a statist. He believed that you needed government controls, that you needed government intervention, that you needed both monetary and physical policy of the government to constantly intervene in the workings of the market in order to preserve conditions so that individuals could be successful. So while he still would argue from the perspective of individual initiative and successful functioning of individuals, to achieve that, you needed government. You needed government involvement in the economy. You needed some level of central planning.
Geez, that guy can't write something simple. He advocated for government intervention and regulation in the economy as a way to reform capitalism, relieve
Again, reforming capitalism.
unemployment woes, and recover from depressions. But his ideas had
A depression caused by statists.
significant opposition from another economist named Friedrich Hayek, who argued people became strangers to the rules of the market. In essence, government deficit spending to promote the 3 Rs were supposedly creating a ruling class over the market,
That's right, that's Hayek.
turning their constituents into serfs, indebted to their overbearing nanny state. He
Yep, that's, that's all true.
essentially wanted a revival of laissez-faire capitalism set forth by the analysis of 1890s economist Alfred Marshall.
Not exactly. I mean, I think that if you asked Hayek, he'd be much more affiliated with Menger than Marshall, but Marshall is kind of the neoclassical economics. Marshall is mainstream traditional economics, but ultimately I think Keynes is a much more of an heir of Marshall's ideas than is Hayek.
This idea spread to America via the Chicago School of Economics. People like Milton Friedman argued that inflation is entirely made in Washington and nowhere else. Well,
Is there an argument that that's not true? Anybody? Anyone?
Friedman's self-proclaimed monetary counter-revolution wasn't taken seriously at first. They gained popularity due to any number of issues throughout the 1970s. One of the quickest ways of spreading it was to emphasize individuality over class concerns, saying everyone can think for themselves, which of course forgets the economic factors that coerce that thought.
Coerce that thought. Not just somebody coercing a thought, I'm not sure how you do that, but economic factors that coerce a thought. That is, you're just a deterministic thing, and your economic situation, economic factors, let's call them, actually cause you, but cause you in a coercive way, so cause you in a way that you have no alternative to because you're being coerced to act in a particular way. And therefore, that undermines the idea that you're an individual, or you have choices, or that you are self-determined and can come to decisions by yourself. No, you are determined by class, which is the Marxist theory, right? So again, one of the things I want you to notice here is I'm taking a video that's not particularly controversial. It's a video that, I don't know, most people on the center right, center left, most people on the populist right would pretty much agree with. Pretty much agree with. And everything is wrong. Everything. I mean, almost every sentence is wrong. And that's what I want you to appreciate, right? Because we're not going to go through 37 minutes of this. We could if somebody paid me to do it. We'd do it. But Ashton, it's not painful in a sense that, you know, this is what I do. It's painful in the sense that it's painful that they don't get it. It's painful that you have to keep repeating yourself over and over again. It's painful that here's an historian who doesn't get history, who doesn't get the individual, doesn't get individual motivation. So how can he understand history when he has such a wrong view of individual behavior? Now, so it's I don't think it's monopoly money. It looks real to me. But this is the challenge that we face in trying to change people's ideas, in trying to change their views. Ashton writes, the real fight for freedom is on the intellectual level, and the cynical historian is a prime example of the intellectual who sounds smart but is abhorrently wrong about capitalism. You know, if he was just abhorrently wrong about capitalism, that would be one thing. But he's wrong about history. He's wrong about cause and effect in history. He's wrong about human nature. And that's, again, the thing I want, you know, I want you to gain appreciation for is the extent to which to the extent to which objectivism is so out of the mainstream. It's so out of the interpretation of history, the interpretation of economics, the interpretation of human nature, the interpretation of how things get done, what produces stuff, how humans interact. So I don't think this guy is particularly messed up. I think this is pretty popular. This is pretty uncontroversial. Again, that the Great Depression was caused by capitalism is not controversial except in the field of economics. Oops.
But the hippie culture of the 1960s and the opposition to their New Left ideology led to increasing hatred of the New Deal paradigm. Neoliberalism effectively atomizes individuality. As prominent neolib Margaret Thatcher said,
by the way, just atomizing individuality is so wrong. What does it mean to atomize them? I mean, atoms form molecules. Does atomizing really mean completely alone? What does it even mean? But they use these terms that everybody's supposed to go, yeah, those guys who want to live on a desert island all by themselves.
who is society? There is no such thing. There are only individual men and women, and they are families, and no government can do anything except through people, and people look to themselves first.
This is where I think, Margaret Thatcher either read Ayn Rand or was influenced by people who read Ayn Rand, because this idea of questioning what society is, emphasizing the role of the individual. Now, there are things about this I don't like. There are men and women and there are families. Really? There are men and women who, they form families, and in that sense, they could form a society. So, and why sneak in families there? Is that important? And no government can do anything except through people, and people look to themselves first. It's not the kind of language Rand would use, but this idea of questioning the existence of society, qua society, as the thing you're trying to improve or trying to maximize, that's very Randian. But that's a good quote from Margaret Thatcher. Okay, we're going to go another 5-10 minutes.
Basically, these theorists believed classes could not constitute a part of economic analysis.
Classes cannot constitute a part of economic analysis. Absolutely, they cannot constitute a part of economic analysis. Classes don't exist. There are people who are poor. That doesn't make them uniform. It doesn't make them the same. It doesn't make them the poor. It doesn't make them a class. It doesn't make them homogeneous. It doesn't make them so we can treat them all the same. There are all kinds of poor. There's students who are poor. There are ambitious people who are poor. There are hardworking who are poor. They're lazy who are poor. There's the wife being drunk that is poor. In other words, there are lots of different poor people. They're all individuals. They all have different reasons for being poor, different motivations, different moral characters, differences. Their economic status is no justification to treat them as a monolith, as a group. But that's his Marxism coming through, right? That's the influence of Marx. Everything is economic class. That's how we analyze history. That's how we analyze economics.
It may seem strange at first, but think about how cultural analysis became prevalent in the 1970s. Scholars increasingly focused on how culture affects individuals. It's called the cultural turn. In fact, this is the foundation of postmodernism as well, which is...
So does it turn out that postmodernism is neoliberal? That's kind of a weird... I don't know where that comes from. Postmodernism is neoliberal. Huh. Postmodernism is subjectivism, no reality, no basis for truth.
Is thoroughly neoliberal in origin.
So postmodernism is thoroughly neoliberal. What does neoliberalism even mean, if that's neoliberalism?
Understand that this neoliberalism, while establishing a rightward drift globally, affected more than just politics, but nearly every facet of our understanding. As Bill Clinton's 1992 headquarters liked to put it, it's the economy, stupid. Perhaps the first economy to implement a neoliberal policy was Chile under Pinochet. Though he was a fascist dictator, he also pushed many of the core tenets of neoliberalism.
Yeah, but he didn't push any of the core tenets of neoliberalism. Pinochet didn't believe in anything except in maintaining power, and even that he ultimately gave up power without a fight. But he didn't believe in anything. But the economic policies that were guiding Chile during the early part of his administration were failing. So in the late 1970s, early 1980s, he basically turned to a new group of economists to say, take a shot, guys, just try. And they happen to be trained at the University of Chicago, so they happen to be relatively pro-capitalist, pro-free markets, and they completely reformed the Chilean economy and completely changed it and made it from the poorest country, which you won't hear, by the way, from the cynical economist, historian, he won't tell you this, but it made it from the poorest country in Latin America to the richest country in Latin America. These neoliberal policies. A slight tilt towards markets goes a long way. And yes, Pinochet was a brutal dictator. He was not a voice of neoliberalism. He accidentally stumbled on it as a last resort. So Pinochet was not a good guy, although again, he left office. You know how he left office? He basically had a referendum that said, if you want democracy, if you want me to run for office instead of just being the dictator, then I will do so. And so there was a referendum. Do you want democracy or not? And the people voted to have democracy. So he accepted it, shockingly. And he thought he would win. There's no question he thought we would win. But he accepted it, and he basically announced an election, which I think he lost, and that was the end of his regime. That was the end of his regime. The policies were maintained until recently, and now they're dismantling all those so-called neoliberal policies in the name of socialism, and what will happen is Chile will become poor. It already has started to stagnate.
The next was Britain under Thatcher,
By the way, I think that happened at about the same time as Thatcher.
quickly followed by the US. The rest of the globe followed suit, leading to a golden age of neoliberalism in the 1980s and 90s.
And what was the economic consequence of this golden ages of a slight move towards greater markets? It was massive wealth creation, lower poverty rates, a rise of many undeveloped countries becoming developed, becoming relatively middle class, huge declines in poverty, and massive wealth creation in the West. New technology, new investment in technology. Will you hear any of that?
To the point that one could argue that even communist China took part under
That's true.
Deng Xiaoping.
And his successors, until this Xi guy, they adopted many of these ideas of a mixed economy tilted towards markets.
Though we might be seeing its demise today, I cannot understate how much this paradigm continues to affect us, especially considering the neoliberal policies we continue today.
Now note that not a word about the billion people coming out of poverty. Not a word about economic growth during this period after stagnation, and not a word, by the way, about inflation of the 70s, not a word about stagnation, not a word about crime and the decline in crime during the so-called neoliberal days in the 90s and 2000s. No history, right? He's the historian. No history, no facts about what actually happened during the 1980s and 1990s in the United States, in Europe, in China. Not a word about the fall of the Berlin Wall, the integration of Eastern Europe into this so-called, quote, neoliberal system, and the success that's had in raising the standard of living of Eastern Europeans from where they were. Nothing. I mean, this is so tainted, right? Because he's an intellectual, but he's not, I don't think he's honest, and he's not looking at reality. Or he's looking at reality through a completely blinding ideological filter. All right, a couple more minutes and then we're done.
So, what brought this about? It's complicated, of course, but one thing above all others is deindustrialization. We celebrate the 1950s economic boom, yet we often ignore the economic changes of the 1960s. In World War II's aftermath, the US was in a special position, being the only industrial power left virtually unaffected. That dominance remained for over a decade, hence the economic boom. But as manufacturing centers grew in places like Germany and Japan, the US lost its industrial dominance. The greatest of our factory towns was Detroit, and they lost jobs so rapidly that systemic issues of racialized housing and exclusion from dwindling jobs led to a race riot there.
Wow, there's a lot going on there. I mean, deindustrialization in the 60s, employment in manufacturing in the United States peaked in the late 1970s, not in the 60s, and has been declined since the late 1970s. Actual production, actual manufacturing, is much higher today than it was then, maybe double or more, with fewer workers, primarily because of technology. But we haven't deindustrialized. We've increased efficiency of industrialization, and we have fewer people working in industrialization. But again, why not talk about when peak employment industrialization happened? It's as if it was the 60s and it wasn't. What's the connection to race riots? Are they really connected? I mean, a lot of the injustices still existed in the 60s, primarily zoning against blacks, but were the race riots really motivated by deindustrialization, or outright discrimination and in a variety of different areas of life.
Even when I covered this topic in a previous video, I failed to speak about this deindustrialization that affected Detroit, though in that one I spoke more about the huge amounts of race riots throughout 1967.
But Detroit and American auto companies were thriving until the late 1970s, with a real threat. And what happened after that? Well, we saw jobs lost, but we saw dramatic increases in efficiency of manufacturing. And of course, we saw the rise of technology, which couldn't have happened without the decline of the Rust Belt and the reallocation of capital. But people think capital is infinite. People don't see a need to see those kind of causal relationships.
Called the Long Hot Summer. But anyways, throughout the 1960s and 70s, the manufacturing centers of the U.S. transformed into what is called the Rust Belt.
The Rust Belt was really a term that happened in the really suffered in the 1980s when, yes, companies shut down, businesses were closed, a lot of the industrial companies of the 1980s went away because they couldn't compete. They couldn't compete. Not because of neoliberalism, because neoliberalism was not relevant yet. It took a while for so-called neoliberalism to become dominant, but they couldn't compete, and they shut down. And what happened as a consequence? Capital got reallocated to technology and to services where we're better and where there are more jobs.
Named for all the rusting machinery of our glory days. These were good jobs lost to deindustrialization.
It's as if deindustrialization is some external, weird, malevolent force. The jobs lost.
Manufacturing was something that most laborers could do with only a high school degree.
It turns out they can also do other things, because the fact is that we have more people working today in the U.S. than ever before. Ever. By far.
Paid well, was typically unionized, and gave a great deal of stability.
Counter to what you might believe and what he believes, people are better paid today. They are. Maybe not minimum wage jobs, but almost everybody else. Average and average wages, if you include benefits and everything else that workers get, are significantly higher, and the things you can buy and the way you can use that money is significantly greater of value. So standard of living went up. I'm not going to get into the whole inequality issue. You can read that in my book, Equal is Unfair, where I go through this whole history. But it truly is amazing the extent to which they pervert and distort the history in the past.
Those kinds of jobs steadily disappeared beginning in the 1960s.
That I've debunked.
But the U.S. did not lose jobs overall. The economy shifted to providing services such as retail, design, innovation, finance, and hospitality.
And why are those not as good as manufacturing?
Instead of production, the U.S. now has a service economy, and that only came about because of deindustrialization.
Yeah, but why did deindustrialization happen? Because of competition, because of technology and because of competition. And those are both good things. Good things. We get things cheaper and better today.
But that transition was a messy one. Throughout the 1970s, the U.S. experienced what's called stagflation.
But notice the transition. That transition was a messy one, implying that the stagflation of the 1970s was caused by deindustrialization. But that's just not true. The stagnation of the 1970s was caused by the inflating of the money supply. It was caused by Nixon going off the gold standard. It was caused by the really, really, really bad economic policies of the Nixon administration, and the inability of Ford and Jimmy Carter to reverse them.
Economic growth, frequently measured by GDP, stagnated, sometimes less than 1% a year. Simultaneously, from 1969 to 82, inflation rates kept rising.
Why? Because of government. Because of government spending, because of the Vietnam War, because of the welfare state, and because of the Fed printing money.
Peaked in 1980 at 14.8%. See, that's stagflation, as in a stagnant economy and high inflation.
And then he shows the Phillips curve, as if, again, the Phillips curve is just given. But the Phillips curve It's not given at all. It's not a curve that most economists believe in, particularly not at the extremes.
Exacerbating these economic woes were two energy crises,
Yep.
one in 1972
Like today.
and another in 1979, due to Middle Eastern oil embargoes. The US economy ran on oil, so people really felt the problem. Stagflation was something Keynesian economics could not cope with.
True.
These were opposing forces in their
Couldn't
models, so
explain.
they could neither predict it nor give adequate policy advice.
That is
Nixon
actually
attempted
true.
to halt it in 1971 by freezing federal wages,
That doesn't
raising
work.
the tariff, and completely removing US currency from the gold standard. It had the opposite effect, leading
But by the way, stagflation only really occurred in the late 70s. In the early 70s, there was just inflation.
to an economic shock. Keynesianism collapsed, leaving room for alternatives like Friedman's monetarism. But neoliberalism is not merely the Chicago School of Economics approach. Keynesianism merely justified reform capitalism, such as the New Deal. Economists have massive influence, but they are not the politicians who ultimately make these policies. Far more went into the change than mere academic thought. One could also see how tough-on-crime rhetoric brought it about. Barry Goldwater campaigned for law and order in 1964 during his presidential campaign, using the Birmingham riots as a way to somehow discredit the Civil Rights Act. This was
It's wrong interpretation of Barry Goldwater and the civil rights, and then he goes into crime, but he never explains that crime went down starting in the 1990s during the height of so-called neoliberalism's power. So, yeah, I mean, that's enough, I guess. I mean, we could go on and on. We could go scene by scene because it's basically the same thing. He uses, graphs that I have shown you are wrong in the past in order to justify his attacks on whatever little bit of free markets we have, to tell you how bad the economy is and how bad economists are. Anyway, that is the story of neoliberalism. Maybe we can continue that video another time, but we've already gone an hour, so I think that's enough. Ashton, thank you again for supporting that and the support you give the show. Huge amount of support even today, so really appreciate that. Jeffrey says you're not wearing the Hortford jersey. I didn't buy one. I just bought a hat. I bought a Celtics hat, and then they lost. That was disappointing. You have to admit, Jeffrey. All right, let's see. I have two. I promised to review two songs. Okay, so here's my review. But before we get to that, I want to remind everybody that one way in which you can support the show and ask questions and be engaged is to use the super chat. You can ask a question, put a dollar amount to it. We're at about $394. No, sorry, we got $394 left to reach our goal of $650. We have not missed our goal yet in the month of June. So we're on the 21st of June already. We're into the final stretch here. We don't want to miss a goal for the month. It's $650, so we've raised $255. We're looking for $395. So ask questions, particularly ask questions of $20 or more, because that way we can get to our goal faster. And hopefully we'll have some people step in here and make sure that we get to the goal. So Catherine can relax tonight and feel like she achieved her goal, achieved her mission that she set out. So $395. All right, so I was asked to comment on two songs. Complete opposites in pretty much every single way. One is Your Horoscope for Today by Weird Al Yankovic. And the other is Deutschland by Rammstein. So I listened to both these songs today, and so I could give you my views. The first thing I'd say is, and this is a good measure of my view of a song. Would I listen to either one of them again? No. Oh, and Deutschland by Hammerstein, it wasn't just the song, it was the music video. We'll get to that in a minute. So let's take Al Yankovic. Very pleasant music, fun, very rhythmic, funny lyrics, entertaining. Yeah, I mean, I enjoyed it, but in a very superficial, minor kind of way, the kind of thing that you would watch like a short Facebook video that was kind of funny and fun, and you'd never watch it again, and you'd never regret watching it again, right? So, and I think that's true of all of Al Yankovic's music. It's all very well done, beautiful harmonies, fantastic production. He's got a good voice. He can do good things with his voice. Again, he's funny. But would I buy the album and listen to a whole album of his? No. Once in a while, one of his songs would be kind of fun and funny. The horoscope for today was certainly fun and funny. But did it leave me moved in any way? No. Did it provide me with what I expect to get from art? Not really. I mean, it's more entertainment and it's more comedy. So his music, I think, is more entertainment. Something to listen to once in a while, but nothing to get excited about. Deutschland by Rammstein is very different. And it's a music video. God. It's dark. It's depressing. It's oppressive. It's the opposite of the lightness of Al Yankovic. It is clearly putting you down. It's supposed to be very intellectual. The lyrics are very intellectual, but it's this is heavy metal at its heaviest. This is supposed to get you down. And this one is, I assume, from what I could understand about it, this is a denunciation of Germany, of what it means to be German, of everything that is German, called Deutschland. And it's ugly. It's not that the music is ugly, it's the way it's presented. It's harsh, it's grating. And it's meant to be. It's meant to be all those things. It's heavy metal after all. The video in particular I found pretty disgusting. I mean, it's gross. It's all violence, from the opening scenes of, I guess, barbarians fighting the Romans and people being hung, to scenes of Jews being hung during the Holocaust, or acted out, not actual documentary, but Jews being hung, to cannibalism. There's a body there and everybody's feasting off of the body. They're literally eating a human being. All meant to suggest that that Germany is sick, that Germany is in decay, that Germany is a culture of violence. Everything is violence. The whole thing is violence. And the music, the steady beat, the steady march, it sounds militaristic. Heavy metal militarism, heavy metal violence. And it's depressing, and sorry, can't listen to it. Won't do it again, won't hear it again, not interested in it again. Those are my reviews. I don't know if those are worth $100. You guys will decide, but I have said I'll review songs for $100. I won't just do it like that because, I don't get a huge amount of value from listening to these, unless, you suggest a really good song. Something you think I'll enjoy. But I will do, at whatever level I can, reviews of music. But it's more my impression of the music than it is any kind of objective analysis of the music. And the more abstract the music is, the more difficult it is for me to do a review, right? So, but yeah, happy to do it. Ears are not bleeding. I didn't suffer too badly, but I didn't enjoy it. Yankovic was kind of fun. Yeah, it was fun. It just wasn't repeatable. And I want stuff that's repeatable. I want stuff that I'd want to listen again. All right. So you can sponsor a show for $1,000. You can sponsor me to do a video commentary for like $500. You can sponsor a TV show, like a one-episode TV show for $250. And you can sponsor a song for $100. And what was, yeah, and I said a movie. Oh, and a movie. A movie's $500, right? A movie's $500. So we've got 1,000, we've got a couple of things for 500, we've got 250, we've got 100. We've got all the sponsorships lined up, which reminds me, don't forget that the show is sponsored by ExpressVPN. ExpressVPN, if you go expressvpn.com/Iran, they'll give you an extra 3 months on your introductory free use, and they'll throw me a few dollars. And then also, other sponsor is fountainheadcasts.com, where you can get beautiful casts of sculpture, worthwhile sculpture. All right. Let's see. Catherine wants to sponsor me to wear a blazer in Puerto Rico. Why? All right. We are now at 344. We're 305. So, we raised 305. We got 344. We haven't even made it halfway. So I don't know if we're going to make it today, Catherine. I don't see us getting to 650 today unless somebody steps in and bails us out, but we'll see. But yeah, June has so far been an exceptional month, and let's see if we can keep it exceptional. And by the way, again, for those of you who don't listen live, who might be listening on a podcast or who might be listening for the video after the fact, the best way for you to support the show value for value, trade with me, is to go and provide support on a monthly basis. You can do it at $2 all the way up to $1,000 a month or more. And you can do that at YourOnBookShow.com/support, on Patreon or Subscribestar, just Your On Book Show, and you can provide that support. On the Leroy, $50, thank you. Yeah, we need a few more questions like this and we're done. Like 7 questions at $50 and we're done. So if you want, interested in, go to Super Chat, ask that question. Have you seen Donald Hoffman on Lex Friedman podcast? Very evil, anti-reality, neo-Kantian baloney with nearly 1 million views a week. Yeah, I know. We did a show on Donald Hoffman. I don't know if you've seen it, but I interviewed Greg Salamieri on Donald Hoffman. We went over his ideas and refuted them or argued against them. You can decide if we actually refuted them, but we argued against them. So I've been aware of Donald Hoffman. I met Donald Hoffman. We were doing this speed introduction at a conference I was at. And so you had 2 minutes to introduce yourself, and you went around to like speed dating. And I sat in front of Donald Hoffman, and he said, what I do is I've proven that evolution has, I can't remember the exact wording he said, but evolution guarantees that we do not actually observe reality. And I went, really? Something like that. Anyway, I've never gotten into a debate with him, a discussion with him, but I've watched this TED Talk. It's terrible. I can't watch 3 hours of Donald Hoffman. That would be way too much. I do think that an objectivist epistemologist, maybe somebody like maybe Harry Binswanger, maybe something like that, should do a show debunking Donald Hoffman. So that I think would be really good. I did one with Greg. I think more objectivists should do this. I think the more we engage with the popular intellectuals of the culture, the better. And taking these ideas and actually engaging with them is what we need to be doing. And I hope that people like Harry, people like Greg, do that in a systematic, regular basis. I'd like them to debunk. I know Harry Binswanger just did a number of shows on Jordan Peterson. He should do Sam Harris. Hopefully he'll do Donald Hoffman as well. Shazbot says, if Ayn Rand wins, will astrology disappear? Yeah. Maybe not completely. Maybe at the margins. Maybe it'll be held in some places. Maybe it'll continue. But yeah, as a prevalent thing, as something you can see in the culture on a regular basis, and horoscopes in newspapers, yeah, all that is gone. All right, those were the $20 questions or above. We now return to the $5, $10, and $15 questions. We're halfway. We're 325. Actually, 326. Thank you, Shazbot, for getting us halfway. Hopefully, it'll take us less time to get the second half than it took the first half. All right, I've only got 5 questions, so you don't have a lot of time to formulate a question and post it on the Super Chat. Liam says, you mentioned on your last show that you have been regularly disappointed by people from your past. In what way? All kinds of ways. I mean, people who I thought were rational turned out to be mystical. People who I thought were honest turned out to be dishonest. People who I thought are my friends turned out to be people who would stab you in the back when the situation. People who I thought were principled turned out to be pragmatists. So I've seen it all. I've seen objectivists become mystics, objectivists become pragmatists, or who are never objectivists. People who I assumed were honest turn out not to be. So I've seen it all. When you're engaged with people for as long as I have been within a movement, you see, I mean, it's the people who survive and the people who you have very long-term relationships. I mean, there's a reason why you have those long-term relationships, because they survive. They've stood the test of time. They're just not as many as I would have expected. Many people fall by the wayside. At least my experience. All right, David has $20, really Canadian, but we'll count it as 20. How will society ever expect capitalism, and how will society ever expect capitalism and truly implement it when every problem is blamed on capitalism? And your thoughts on late-stage capitalism? Yeah, I mean, we have to constantly fight the fact that every problem is blamed on it. So at some point, the world will become so not capitalist that people will go, yeah, well, this can't be capitalism. I mean, even today, one of the good, the left is trying to blame inflation on corporate greed. But nobody actually believes that. Almost nobody, I don't think. I mean, there are a few nutty leftists, but most people get that inflation is, yeah, the government spent a lot of money and the Fed printed a lot of money and supply chain issues, that's the cause of inflation. They get that. And I don't see a lot of like Occupy Wall Street types saying, oh, it's corporations, it's greedy corporations, they're the cause of this. So there are opportunities for us to come in and say, yes, see, all this bad stuff, that's the consequence of statism. And here's what capitalism will actually do. So it's education, 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 education. And it's hard work, and it takes a long time, and it exerted effort, focused effort, concentrated effort. And it's just you keep after doing it. And that's how you get people's minds changed. There is no such thing as late-stage capitalism. Late-stage capitalism is this idea that capitalism morphs into cronyism, and cronyism is late-stage capitalism. No, cronyism is cronyism. And yes, it's true that the system today, which is cronyism, not capitalism, which is a mixed economy, not capitalism, is unstable and is necessarily going to fail. But that's not because it's late-stage capitalism, it's because it's no capitalism. It's because it's cronyism, because it's a mixed economy. That's the cause of the instability and the problems. So late-stage capitalism, there is no early stage, late stage, middle stage. Capitalism is a thing. It just is. The later, the more it's practiced, the better things are, broadly speaking, right? But it's never really fully been practiced. Hopper Campbell, Ayn Rand said the right has no intellectual leadership. That's why the good people in the West may be defeated. Is this still true today? Well, I think the right has no consistent intellectual leadership. I think to the extent, I think that's right. I think to the extent that the right today has intellectual leadership, it is really, really bad. And that's why good people of the West are going to be defeated, are being defeated. Because both the right and the left now have intellectuals, but they're bad intellectuals, statist intellectuals, collectivistic intellectuals. So if we get away from right and left, American individualism, the kind of American sense of life, which is individualistic, has no intellectual leadership other than the objectivists, maybe a few people who call themselves libertarian, maybe a few, people who are in the center, different aspect of it, but there's very little intellectual effort centered around the fundamental central idea of America, which is individualism. So again, left, right, and left, right are both junk now, are both anti-intellectual, well, not anti-intellectual, are both founded on collectivism. And individualism has no defense, and that's why the West will die, or the West is dying. Hopefully we can save it, but that's why the West is dying. All right, Richard with $20. What's your take on nuclear-powered desalination? Any downside beside the usual nuclear fear? No, none. But why stop at desalination? Nuclear-powered, fill in the blank. Nuclear-powered electrification. I'm for that. And desalination is a fantastic technology. California just rejected it, and then it constantly complains about droughts. But California should be, Israel has completely solved its water problems. It's always been a country susceptible to droughts. Israel has solved its water problems by building desalination plants. And they are no longer susceptible to droughts because they can desalinate. And combine that with nuclear power, which is cheap once the power plant is built, but cheap and power forever, then that is ideal, particularly for somewhere like California, which has a long coast. It could place a desalination plants in several locations and has real droughts, real problems. And with climate change, maybe more droughts, I don't know. But the solution to droughts is not stop using fossil fuel. The solution to droughts is desalinate. We could actually export water to Nevada and Arizona and other places that need it if you desalinate it. Stephanie asked for $20 again. Wow. This is great. $20 questions are great. More $20 questions. The challenge, of course, is it's going to be a challenge to get to the 650 with $20 questions. But we'll keep going. In the essay at the end of War and Peace, Tolstoy says something like, the longer time passes after an event, the more it feels like it had to happen that way. I reject determinism, but it sure can feel that way. Yes, because while things are not deterministic, once a certain course of events happens, once you make a certain decision about something in life, there are certain consequences that have to happen as a consequence of that decision. You could change your mind, but you've set something in motion. And the same is true of history. Once certain things happen in history, it sets stuff in motion, and then it seems to have had to happen because of that sequence of causal events. And it's more difficult, looking back at it, to imagine how you would deviate away from those events, because you can see the big picture. You can see the chain of events that when you're in the moment, you can't necessarily see the causal relationship between them because you're in the midst of it. I hope that answers the question. A very good question, generally about kind of history. Jennifer says, for $20, you can live in grace and comfort in the world that you transform. That's a beautiful line from Neil Poet. You can live in grace and comfort in the world that you transform. Very inspired by Ayn Rand, I take it. And, you know, that's free will. The world that you transform. It turns out you did build that. At least Neil Poet thought you built it, and you had the potential to build it, and you can build it. That's great. James Taylor asked, do you think the progress we've seen in tech has given people more of a benevolent universe premise, more optimism about human progress that 100 years of statism has been crushing? Yes. I mean, I think the advances in tech are the best things that have happened in the civilized world over the last 30 years. And I think it gives people the courage to think about a positive future. It gives people the imagination to imagine an amazing future. And it gives people the confidence that amazing things can happen in the future. So, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, and particularly given that other parts of the economy, other parts of the culture are depressing. This is the one area where there's progress, where things are moving forward, where things are getting better, when every version is better, where customer service is decent, where, yeah, things are moving, things are happening. You know, let's hope people don't get too depressed by the current stock market declines, particularly in tech. Michael Sanders asked, why don't they want the poor people starting businesses? Because they don't care about poor people. They don't care about anybody. They want control. They want people to be dependent on them. And they don't want the proof that everything they believe in is wrong, which they would have if, existentially at least, if poor people, you know, were thriving. And the way they prevent poor people from starting businesses is easy. Licensing. Like licensing. License to shampoo hair and license for nail, what do you call it, pedicure, manicures, and fees to open a salon, and all these things. They're not there to protect anybody, and they're not there to for the middle class. They're there to put roadblocks in the way of the poor from succeeding. Business taxes, business regulations on small businesses. These are often zoning laws. These are often local laws that do this, right? I mean, if we really wanted to license, why don't we license programmers? I don't want to give anybody ideas, but programmers are more important and have the potential to do more damage than people who shampoo hair or people who do your nails. They write the software that runs airplanes, that runs nuclear power plants, that runs almost everything in our modern life, and yet you don't need a license to program. But you need a license to shampoo somebody else's hair. Why? Well, one reason is they want to hold down, in the name of protecting the poor, all that they do is hurt the poor. It's pretty ugly. It's pretty ugly and disgusting. Catherine asked, when are you getting a tour of your condo art decor? Want a virtual tour. Would love to see the art you have. Yeah, I mean, what I need is to put up a video of the apartment on YouTube and then run you through that. So I have a plan, but it's taking me longer to actually execute on that. So maybe soon. That would be a fun thing to do. That would be a fun thing to do. You might see my apartment and see how nice it is and not do super chats anymore. I don't know. I'm worried, I guess. How is objectivism exempt from left-right, even if only comparatively? Is it not fair to see Harry Binswanger generally on your left and Peikoff to your right? That is just an insult to Peikoff and Harry Binswanger, and neither one of that is true. So, for example, Harry Binswanger believes you should be able to own, as far as I know, is my interpretation of what I think Harry believes. You should be able to own any gun you want. No government involvement, no government licensing, no government background checks, none of that. That's clearly to my right from the politically conventional view. But he holds that in immigration, borders should be completely open. And is that to the left? Does the left believe in open borders? I don't think so. Bernie Sanders doesn't. I mean, I can get you a quote from Bernie Sanders where he says you have to limit immigration. You have to reduce immigration. Immigration is bad for poor people. It's bad for unions. So these categories are stupid. Left and right is a stupid category. And it's really, really useless, worse than useless, to try to apply it to rational people who are struggling with complex issues and trying to solve them. Bernie is not on the right or the left. Bernie is a leftist. Leftism does not include open borders on immigration, as far as I can tell. It never has. Marxists, it depends on the type of Marxist. If they're international Marxists, yeah, one world government. Does Bernie believe in one world government? I don't think so. Does Bernie believe in open borders? No, he doesn't. So what does left and right mean? I've argued it doesn't mean anything. Now, I believe that the spectrum is individualism and collectivism. Forget left, forget right. The point is, nobody's on the left and nobody's on the right. Left and right don't mean anything. Harry's not on the left and Harry's not on the right. Leonard is not on the left and Leonard is not on the right. They have views that are derived from observation and particular premise about the world. They're capitalists. But how they apply capitalism, they're pro-individual rights, they're on the individualist spectrum of collectivism versus individualism. But when you get to that individualist spectrum, there's some disagreements about minor issues about application. But that doesn't make the disagreement left-right. Issues are not left and right. The only spectrum is individualism, collectivism. You can categorize the issues any way you want, but how do you categorize people who hold some from the left and some from the right, or what you've categorized as some from the left? And then there are issues like immigration that don't fit left and don't fit right, don't fit either one of those categories. Is a view of race from the perspective of colorblindness a left perspective or a right perspective? Well, it used to be a left perspective, but it's not anymore. They don't believe in colorblindness. It's never been a rights perspective, not really. So what is it, left or right? It's an individualistic perspective. It's the right perspective, right not in terms of direction, but in terms of truth. But it's not right or left. Why are you holding on to these categories? Why can't you let go? Left and right doesn't matter. It's not. Colorblindness is not a right issue. I mean, the Proud Boys or whatever they're called, the Charlottesville marches, are they right? Yeah, I think everybody thinks of them as right. Are they colorblind? No, of course not. So colorblindness can't be a right issue. So You're sticking to categories that mean nothing. You're trying to categorize them in ways that is not helpful for cognition, and it makes you confused. It makes your ability to think inferior. You can make generalizations, but they're not useful if they don't apply to anything. To say the right is colorblind is wrong. It's wrong and ridiculous. They are collectivists, some of which are leftists, some of which are rightists, but what really unifies them is their collectivism. And they're individualists. And the individualists might disagree about particular issues, but their fundamental way of analyzing the problem and their fundamental way of looking at the world and analyzing progress is from the perspective of the individual. So I reject left, right. I use it only in a sense that people use left and right, so to identify the people that commonly are referred to as left and right, but there is no such thing as a leftist objectivist or rightist objectivist. There's an objectivist who thinks this on an issue, a specific concrete issue like immigration, and an objectivist who thinks something else on it. And neither one of them is right or left. And I know that's hard for you, but that's reality. David asks, if you were running for president, what policies would be on your platform? Well, I mean, they would be the policies of liberty, the policies of freedom. I would run on a platform of separating separating government from economics. I would run on a platform of massive deregulation, of elimination of all subsidies and all restrictions on business, on basically liberating business from government. That would be the number one agenda item that I would run on. I would run on a platform that involved separating government from education, the complete separation of government from education. So the government is not involved in any aspect of education, and the same ultimately with science. But I would run on a platform that initially started out with getting business separated from government, and then only afterwards dealt with welfare and eliminating welfare and eliminating entitlements over a long period of time, adjusting those things. I mean, I like the platform of the Capitalist Party. The Capitalist Party that was founded, 6 years ago or something, but it's never, I don't think, ever run a candidate. Mark Pellegrino was one of the founders of it. And but they never did anything with it, unfortunately. But that's a platform I would run on. I think it's a good platform. You might tinker with it a little bit here. You might emphasize things in order to get elected here or there, but that's what I would run for. Stephen, you once mentioned you're one of the few people who like Godfather 3. I do. I like it too, the ending in particular. What do you like about it? Do you have favorite Godfather lines? I don't. I mean, I like it. I mean, my favorite part of it is the one aesthetic aspect that runs through all three Fountainheads, and that is this arc that they create within, where there's, again, the sequence of events that kind of closes out in kind of a circle where everything is revealed and everything is exposed, and the revenge happens and the story is kind of closed. I don't remember enough of the details of Godfather 3 or any of the Godfathers to really talk too much about it. But yeah, I mean, I like that closure. I like the way that Francis Ford Coppola built these movies. I like their structure and the atmosphere and the way they're shot. I like all the aesthetic elements. The story is a gangster story. It's not my favorite story in the world, but it works. It works. It's very, very well told, and it's very, very well delivered as art. Colt says, it's true on Twitter I've been called far left for supporting Ukraine, and I was added to a list called far right-wing Mormons. makes me think how arbitrary it is I'm on the side of freedom and individuals. Yeah, we are impossible to categorize because we're not left and we're not right. And you can't categorize objectivists that way. And you can't create a sub-world within objectivism where there's left and right because it's all meaningless. All right, Ed, and I think this is the last question, unless somebody steps in. Where are we? We are $180 short. $180 short. $180 that are going to cause Catherine not to sleep tonight because she didn't meet her goal. Yep. Yeah, that's what we do here at the Yaron Brook Show. If you don't meet your goal, you don't sleep the next night. That's the consequences. So Paul says he's got this. Don't worry. All right, I'm not worried. You should tell Catherine not to worry. All right, Ed asks, I love what Ayn Rand said about capitalism and statism. It's the battle of those who expropriate versus those who create wealth. Yeah. Capitalists create wealth. Statists expropriate it. And it's the same with spiritual values. Capitalists and good people want to live. They want to create values. They want to engage in trade. They want to build. They want to promote. They want to enlarge. They want to make things better, right? Their life better. Statists, so they're equivalent in the culture and the spiritual world, in people's day-to-day life, are destroyers. They don't want to trade. Everything's a zero sum. They want to take. They want to take from you spiritually and materially. They want the culture to I'm reading Paul trying to shame you all into achieving the goal. So yes, so in every realm of life, one is the builder and one is the destroyer, whether it's wealth, whether it's any aspect of human life. All right, Ashton, this is the last question again, and we're still $170 short, Paul. So I don't know if you're going to pitch in 170, or if you're just going to keep using shame on this group of individualists, hopefully egoists, to try to get them to trade here. Ashton says, you're not left or right or centrist. So what are you? I'm not left, no right, no centrist. I'm an individualist. I'm a capitalist. I'm not on a spectrum. I'm on a spectrum. The spectrum of collectivism versus individualism, statism versus capitalism. That's the only spectrum that matters. And that's the spectrum I'm on. All right, Shazbot says, laughter is the very best medicine. Remember that when your appendix bursts next week. Is this from Al Yankovic's song? My appendix did burst, and it was no laughing matter. All right. It was very unpleasant. It was a long time ago. Frank asks, in Godfather 3, Michael's wife tells him she has an abortion. How do you think people respond to this instance of an abortion happening in marriage? I don't know. I mean, she doesn't want it. It's clear that in this case, she has an abortion because she doesn't want another child brought into this family. And she takes on the moral responsibility of not bringing another human life into the sphere of influence of the Godfather. And in that sense, she's very courageous. I think different people respond differently, but I think it's completely understood that she's doing this as a slap to Michael, as a slap to Michael, but also as an expression of the evil that is the kind of life that she is living and the kind of life that her children are going to live because of Michael. So it's a form of rebellion by preventing this evil from happening to a child. And another reason to keep to keep abortion legal is to allow mothers to do that. Imagine if the father's super abusive and, I don't know, for whatever reason she can't get a divorce and leave him, but she gets pregnant from him, and now she's stuck with a child that she knows is going to be abused by the father. I think she should have the option to abort. Owen, thank you for the $20. This is now the last question. They keep coming in, and we're now I'm posting it, short $125, basically. Yep, well, we just got another 20, so we're short $103. $103 we're short. Owen says, were the early political parties in America based on more principled differences, or were they always arbitrary? No, I think they were based on more principled differences. And look, there are some differences between Democrats and Republicans, and there have been periods in history where the differences were big. For example, over slavery, there was a big difference. Over the New Deal, there was a big difference. The differences have grown smaller and smaller as Republicans have become more left, but the differences exist. And it's not like there are no differences today. It's not helpful to view the differences as left and right. You've got to get into what are the differences. And the differences today are more around, for example, social issues than they are about economic issues. What is that? Okay, is that what left and right mean? Is that what left and right has always meant? Because that's not what it used to mean. So it's just not useful to talk about it as left and right. It's not useful. What's useful is to talk about the particular issues and whether this perspective is right or this perspective is right. This issue is right or this issue is right. That's what's useful. You can talk about the political parties and which one you think is more damaging to America in the short run, in the long run, tomorrow, in 100 years, what impact they have on American culture and so on. All of that is useful to show the differences between them. I think that the parties originally were more similar than they are, in a sense, because they all accepted the Constitution. They all had a good understanding of what the Constitution meant. But then they had differences between them about certain interpretation and certain application of the Constitution. So in a way, they were more similar, but the differences were sharper and more intellectual. I hope that answers. Jace asked for another $20. Thought about asking out a girl client at work or female client. Thoughts about asking out a girl client at work or female client, not a colleague. Why are you saying a girl client or female client? Aren't those two the same, or is it an issue of age? Yeah, I think it's fine. I mean, I think that we're way too hesitant, well, for good reason today, but the culture is way too negative about people, have a relationship that might work together or might be in business together or might have some kind of business relationship. I mean, you have to be careful and you have to be objective and you have to have full disclosure when it's relevant. But look, if you like somebody, go for it. And, make sure that you're not stepping on anybody's toes from a work perspective. But political correctness with regard to dating is just, some of it is ridiculous. Some of it's right. Some of it's, I think, men are being too brutish towards women. But some of it is complete garbage. Ross says, I don't have a great question at this time, but I wanted to thank you for providing some of the only meaningful content in all of YouTube. Thank you, Ross. I really appreciate that. I wish more people agreed. That would be cool. If we got to that point where more people agreed, it would be good. If we had hundreds of thousands of subscribers. I mean, that guy, the Cynical historian, has 250,000 subscribers. I have 33,000. It's just disappointing. All right, we are $73 short. Paul is still working hard to try to get us. Paul, and is Catherine still around, or is she just giving up and giving it to Paul? Paul, go for it. All right, another $20. So we're slowly chipping away at this. I didn't think we could do it with $20 chunks, but I guess we can. Colt says, right-wing morons, not Mormons. Sorry, another thing about my dad is he's not very political. He's kind of a guy who likes to stick his personal life, works and works. He's often critical of how much I talk about politics. Yeah, I think at the end of the day, I think I like your dad, Colt. I think so far the virtues way outweigh any kind of issues I might have with him, because I think that's the American way. Americans are not very political historically. They put their nose down and get business done, and live your life, and that's the way, you know, it is. Jeffrey says my subscriptions are better people. Absolutely, they're better people, and they're more generous people. I think on average, I get support for, you know, more support than people with similar subscription bases as mine, right? You guys are super supportive, and we're only $23 away from meeting our goal. So, you know, we're going to count this as meeting the goal, particularly if somebody puts in $25. But I mean, that's amazing that we are through Super Chat doing this. And then, of course, there's all the people who give monthly. You guys are the most generous subscribers I think any show has on YouTube on a per capita, per person basis. I mean, I know people like Lex Friedman and Malice and so on, they probably make millions of dollars off of their Patreon subscription accounts, but they have hundreds of thousands and more than 1 million people, so on average. But my guess is my subscription base, you guys give on average more. So I am very proud and happy to have one of the most, if they're not the most generous, and you're a bunch of selfish objectivists, and you're amazingly generous because you see the value of trade, the value of value for value. All right, we're over 650. We made it. Thank you, guys. And Paul, I don't know what you did, but you're hired. Jeffy says, I hope you'll make it back to the restaurant. Of course I will. I haven't been to, New York. I haven't been to New York with time to come. I've only been to New York once since I've been to your restaurant. I mean, God, I used to go to New York every month or two. I mean, it's been, business is just, that part of the business has just been super slow. And I haven't made it out to New York. And I haven't been invited to give talks in New York. I mean, Paul is using Jesus' methodology, and he says it works. Peter Schiff gets more on his live stream than you on. Yeah, Peter Schiff has a lot more subscribers than I do. So yeah, many more subscribers. Let's see. So yes, I will definitely be back in New York. I will definitely be back at your restaurant. I'm hoping to bring my wife next time. I want to spend more time in New York. One of my goals in life is to spend more time in New York, and I still haven't been able to structure my life in a way to do that. I'm working on it. Maybe next year. This year's kind of finished. My schedule's kind of done. So, you know, the soonest I can do it is next year. So I'm hoping next year to be more of a New York person. That's my goal. Richard, contributing for Catherine, pushing for Paul, for the goal. Thank you, Richard. Really appreciate it. Thank you, Catherine. MH08. What is the difference between what I am and who I am? I don't think there is a difference. Apollo, thank you for the support. I don't think there is a difference. What I am and who I am. Yeah, I think it's basically the same. It's a different orientation. The who is more of the I, the control, the shaping of what I am. What I am is what the who has shaped, but it's really the same thing. All right. Thanks, everybody. I appreciate it. I will see you all on Thursday. I might be doing, on Thursday, I might comment on a video called What is a Woman? And it'll be quite epistemological. It'll be interesting. So we'll probably do that on Thursday. That should get a lot of views. And then the weekend. Thank you again to all the Super Chatters. This has been fantastic. Thank you to all the monthly subscribers and to all the monthly supporters. Thank you to subscribers. Don't forget to like the show before you leave. It really helps the algorithm. So we've got more people who are listening right now live than have pressed the like button. But the like button is incredibly valuable because it raises my profile on YouTube and therefore gets more people to the show, which I think you all want. Thanks, everybody. See you on Thursday.